Today we want to talk about Pentecost and Paul. There's different opinions on whether or not feast days need to be kept. The question is, have all the feast days been fulfilled? There's some of the opinion that all feast days were fulfilled by Jesus. He came as our Paschal Lamb and died and put an end to the feast days. The other opinions are that, no, that's not true. These feast days continue on. And a perfect example of that is that Paul kept the Feast of Pentecost. So I'd like to look at that today. Regarding Paul keeping the Pentecost is 1 Corinthians 16:8. 1 Corinthians 16:8, did Paul observe Pentecost and the other feasts? And Paul said in 1 Corinthians 16:8, but I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. He planned to wait at Ephesus until Pentecost. Also in Acts 20 and verse 16, for Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. So it seemed that Paul had this intention to keep Pentecost. Certainly he intended to be in Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Paul did understand one thing. Whichever side of the debate you're on, he understood one thing. He understood that he had to go to Jerusalem if he was going to keep the feast. And he would base that on many, many scriptures, and I'll give you some examples, that the feast must be kept at Jerusalem. 1 Kings 12:27, we had the situation where the kingdom had been split. We had the 2 kingdoms of the south and then the 10 kingdoms of the north. And the king of the north decided he was going to set up his own altar up there because he was concerned that people would always go to Jerusalem for the feast. So 1 Kings 12:27 and 8, if this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto him, is it too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. So the feast had to be kept in Jerusalem. That's where all the people would go. And this king decided he wanted to set up another altar in the northern kingdoms. But that was against God. We also see in 2 Chronicles 30 and verse 13, and there assembled at Jerusalem much people to keep the feast of unleavened bread in the 2nd month, a very great congregation. Now Israel was taken into captivity, and when they were in Babylon, they could not keep the feasts. They may have remembered the feast, but they were not able to keep the feast because they did not have the altar in Jerusalem to hold the blood sacrifices on. All the offerings of the feast, all the feast required offerings. And all the offerings were to be brought to the high priest, and they were to be sacrificed on that altar. And therefore, to keep the feast, it must be at the altar in Jerusalem. When they returned to the land under Ezra, chapter 3 and verse 1, we see in the 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in the cities and gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. And in verse 5, they offered the continual burnt offering of new moons and set feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and everyone willingly offered a free will offering unto the Lord. So it was not until Israel was able to come back into the land and back into Jerusalem that they were able to hold any of the feasts properly. Jesus spoke with the Samaritan woman, and she had said, basically that her fathers had worshipped on this mountain, However, it's taught that Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. That's in John 4:20. And Jesus said unto her, Believe me, the hour cometh when ye should neither worship in this mountain, nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. So we see clearly that it was required to worship at Jerusalem. Even Jesus acknowledged that. But he goes on to point to a future time when worship would not take place at either. Where he said in 4:24, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem to keep the feast. That was their custom. Luke 2:41, they went every year to the feast of the Passover. And 42, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. If the feast didn't need to be kept in Jerusalem, why would they journey there? All the feasts required this journey to Jerusalem. The sacrifice of an offering, a blood sacrifice to cover the sins of the nation. The sacrifices were all part and parcel of the feast. As you look at how God laid them down in Exodus, down through Deuteronomy, that he attached the offering and the sacrifice at the place in Jerusalem. And he would say, when you come into the land, ye shall keep this feast. When you come into the land, ye shall give this offering. These were all attached to the land of Israel, and specifically to the altar in Jerusalem. So Paul rightly decided if he was going to keep this feast, he had to haste to Jerusalem. Paul, as an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin, his first love, his first feelings, honestly, were for his countrymen. He knew himself how he had been so zealous for God as an Israelite that he even persecuted Christians and brought them to judgment and certain death. And he knew how blinded he had been as an Israelite. And when Jesus came upon him and gave him his vision, a vision so bright it blinded him and the scales had to be removed from his eyes later, Paul realized how much of a blinding there was at that time on Israel. And yet it was in his heart to preach the good news to Israel itself. He was so desirous to bring his fellow countrymen, Jews, into the gospel of Christ that he would go to almost any length. Romans 11:14 reads, If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Paul's mind was always on them. As he went to every city in Asia, he would first seek out the Jews. He would preach in every synagogue. He would call the leaders of each synagogue. He did this before as a free man, and he did it later in bondage. He would call the Jews out and preach to them. And some would accept him, and many would reject him. Paul was so adamant about converting his countrymen that he would give his own life. He was willing to die. Acts 21:13, then Paul answered, What mean ye to weep and break mine heart? For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus.